Most people don't realize it, but there is a silent, almost invisible behavior that dominates a large part of modern human relationships. The compulsion to explain oneself constantly. It is a habit that seems harmless, even polite, even admirable. After all, justifying your choices, your emotions, your absences, or your mood changes can sound like empathy, like consideration for others. But behind this constant need to justify oneself lies something much deeper and infinitely more disturbing, a poorly healed psychological wound. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest minds in analytical psychology, identified this pattern as a clear symptom of disconnection from the self. For him, the repeated attempt to convince others about who you are, what you feel, and why you act in certain ways, actually reveals a profound state of self-neglect, of self-abandonment. The person who constantly explains themselves is often unconsciously seeking something they never received in childhood: permission to exist. This behavior almost always arises in environments marked by chronic emotional invalidation. These are contexts, often familial, where the child's subjective experience is systematically disqualified. That's nonsense. You're exaggerating. There's no reason to feel that way. Stop being so sensitive. The internalized message is brutal and life-shaping. What I feel only has value if others understand it, approve of it, or allow it. Over time, this belief transforms into an invisible prison, where the individual becomes psychologically dependent on others' understanding to affirm their own internal reality. When an adult compulsively explains themselves, they are unconsciously trying to avoid abandonment, judgment, or rejection. They believe that if others fully understand their reasons, perhaps they won't criticize them, won't distance themselves, won't reject them. It is a desperate attempt to control others' perception to ensure belonging and emotional security. But this constant, exhausting effort comes at a very high price, the loss of one's own psychological autonomy. By focusing all energy on external validation, the individual begins to systematically neglect their internal authority. They no longer act because they genuinely believe in something. They act because they need to justify themselves, to avoid being misunderstood. They no longer feel freely and authentically. They rationalize their emotions to avoid the discomfort of being viewed negatively. Gradually, imperceptibly, they stop living for themselves and start performing for others, trapped in an eternal theater where the audience has infinitely more power than the protagonist. Jung understood this phenomenon as a central obstacle on the path to individuation, the lifelong process by which a human being truly becomes who they authentically are. And the truth is harsh. As long as there exists a constant need to explain oneself, there is no inner freedom whatsoever. Because compulsive explanation is actually a sophisticated form of psychological submission. It is as if with each justification the individual is unconsciously saying, "I can only exist if you allow it. I can only be valid if you approve." This video is an invitation to dismantle this deep conditioning, a thorough analysis of why so many people live trapped in the need to justify themselves, and what happens when they finally choose silence. When they decide to stop explaining themselves, something changes radically within the psyche. The soul, previously bent before external approval, begins to rise with a new posture, that of internal authority. And this transformation changes absolutely everything. The wound that creates the need for explanation. Behind the compulsive need to explain oneself, there is something much deeper than education or simple desire to be understood. It is a psychic wound, embedded at the very core of identity formation. Jung understood that this compulsion for self-explanation is not just a behavioral habit or personality quirk. It is a symptom, a visible reflection of something much older, buried in the unconscious. The deeply held belief that one's existence only has value when validated by others. This wound forms early, almost always in childhood, in environments where the child's subjectivity is constantly delegitimized. When a child expresses sadness and hears that they are being dramatic, when they show anger and are called difficult or disrespectful, when they reveal fear and receive disdain or irony in response, they begin to internalize a dangerous, life-altering message. What I feel is wrong. I cannot trust my own experience. I can only trust the responses of others. Over time, the child develops an unconscious defense mechanism, trying desperately to be understood in order to feel safe. They learn that if they explain well enough what they feel, they may not be punished, ignored, or ridiculed. And thus, a pattern is born that will be carried into adulthood like invisible chains, justifying every emotion, every decision, every attitude, as if a convincing rational argument were needed to have the basic right to feel and to be. At the root of this wound is the devastating loss of internal authority. The person no longer sees themselves as someone whose experience is valid in itself, inherently worthy. They come to depend completely on the external gaze to confirm whether what they live and feel has legitimacy or not. This creates a psychological state of perpetual submission, where self-esteem is not built from within, from self-knowledge and self-acceptance, but from the reflection in the eyes of others. It is entirely externalized. It is crucial to understand that this dynamic does not happen consciously. Often those trapped in this pattern do not even realize that they are constantly trying to convince others that their emotions are reasonable, that their decisions have logic, that their behavior has acceptable motives. But behind every explanation there is a hidden fear lurking, the fear of being rejected for simply being who they are, without modification or justification. Jung asserted that every individual needs, at some point in their life, to consciously confront this inherited internal structure. Until they do, they remain operating according to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from authority figures in childhood, such as parents, teachers, or religious leaders. The individual becomes a reflection of what others would approve of, not of who they truly are at their core. This compulsive self-explanation, therefore, is actually a form of ongoing self-abandonment. It is the repeated act of betraying one's own truth to make it more palatable, more acceptable to others. And it is precisely at this recognition point that the healing process can begin, recognizing that you no longer need to ask for permission to exist. That your emotions, no matter how intense, contradictory, or strange they may seem to others, do not need to be justified to deserve space in your life. But this awakening does not happen without pain. When the individual begins to consciously silence themselves in the face of the habitual need to justify, the silence that arises is initially disconcerting, because it reveals the emptiness left by the absence of a consolidated internal authority that was never properly developed. And it is precisely about this that Jung speaks when introducing one of the central pillars of his psychology, the construction of internal authority. If this content is making sense to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue this work. The betrayal of self through constant explanation. Compulsive self-explanation is not just a defense mechanism or social habit. It is a continuous act of self-betrayal. A silent betrayal, often completely imperceptible to the conscious mind, but deeply corrosive to psychological well-being. Carl Jung understood that every time an individual shapes their words to avoid displeasing others, hides their authentic emotions to maintain artificial harmony, or suppresses their true decisions to avoid judgment, they are distancing themselves from themselves. They are, in fact, abandoning their own truth piece by piece. This internal betrayal does not happen explosively, like a violent, dramatic break with the self. On the contrary, it is gradual, subtle, happening every single day in small moments. It occurs when you laugh at something you don't actually find funny to seem sociable, when you say yes while meaning no to avoid being seen as selfish or difficult, when you explain your sadness as mere tiredness because you don't want to be perceived as a burden, when you feel genuine anger but disguise it as calm rationality, fearing to seem immature or out of control. With each small concession made in the name of acceptance, a part of the soul is left behind, abandoned. Jung identified that this type of behavior is a direct reflection of the ego disconnected from the self. The ego, which should be merely the functional center of consciousness, becomes instead a servant of external acceptance. It constantly reconfigures itself to become what others want to see. And in this constant adaptation, the individual progressively loses touch with themselves. They stop listening to their own intuition. They disbelieve their own feelings. They question their most authentic motivations. Chronic doubt takes the place of inner confidence. This process of self-abandonment is particularly insidious because it is often socially valued and rewarded. People who adjust well, who know how to explain themselves smoothly, who avoid conflicts, who are easy to get along with, are frequently praised as mature, reasonable, socially skilled. But behind this false harmony often lies a deep emotional exhaustion, the exhaustion of those who live entirely for others but can no longer hear themselves, can no longer access their own truth. Jung asserted that this type of internal fragmentation is one of the primary causes of neuroses in modern people. When the ego distances itself too much from the self, the symbolic center of psychic wholeness, Psychological symptoms inevitably arise: chronic anxiety, existential crises, feelings of profound emptiness, difficulty in making decisions, persistently low self-esteem. And why do these symptoms emerge? Because the soul is screaming to be heard. But it has been systematically silenced in the name of social adaptation and external approval. Deep down, what is at stake here is a crucial existential question. Whose life is this? As long as you are constantly seeking approval to feel, think, or act, your existence will be merely a performance, an edited version of your truth. You will always be a character in someone else's narrative, never the author of your own story. The only way to break this cycle of self-betrayal is to reclaim internal authority. It is to develop the capacity to uphold your truth even when it is not understood, even when it causes discomfort in others, even when it challenges their expectations of who you should be. This is the beginning of true individuation, becoming whole, even if it means disappointing others. Building internal authority, the path to freedom. For Carl Jung, true psychological freedom does not arise from social acceptance or external understanding. It emerges from the deliberate development of internal authority. This concept, absolutely central to his theory of individuation, represents the individual's capacity to validate their own subjective experience without relying on the approval of others. It is the pivotal moment when you stop asking yourself, will they understand what I feel? And start asserting with quiet confidence, it doesn't matter if they understand. This is true for me. Internal authority is the complete opposite of compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is anchored in insecurity and the desperate need to justify every step to be accepted, internal authority arises from the deep conviction that your truth does not need to be negotiated with anyone. And this shift is not merely intellectual or theoretical. It is existential. It is a fundamental change of axis. The center of gravity of the psyche shifts dramatically. It moves from the periphery of external approval back to the center of the self, where the totality of being resides. But this transition is not simple or easy. It requires genuine courage. Because by ceasing to explain yourself, the individual directly confronts their deepest fears: the fear of abandonment, the fear of judgment, the fear of social exclusion. Jung said that individuation requires traversing the desert of inner solitude, that challenging moment when for the first time you hold a no without guilt, when you do not justify yourself for changing your mind, when you end a conversation without explaining why, not out of arrogance or cruelty, but simply because you owe nothing to anyone, merely to exist. Developing this authority does not mean becoming insensitive or closed to authentic dialogue. On the contrary, it means that you no longer need to beg for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not as a desperate plea for acceptance. Communication ceases to be a performance and becomes genuine expression. It is the profound difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. In practice, internal authority manifests in small daily gestures, in silence in the face of provocation, in the firmness of saying that does not resonate with me without needing to explain why in detail, in the refusal to participate in an emotional game where you always have to justify your position, and above all, in the ability to endure the discomfort of not being understood, and still remain whole and intact. Jung believed that this is one of the most important moments of the psychological journey, the instant when the individual stops outsourcing their self-esteem and begins to recognize it as something that arises authentically from within. This transition is both symbolic and powerfully real. It marks the break with the old conditioned self, the one that lives to please, and the birth of a new self, rooted, autonomous, whole. But this new stance is not well received by everyone. On the contrary, the silence that arises from internal authority often disturbs those around you. People who previously benefited from your insecurity begin to lose their control over you. Manipulators feel threatened. Relationships based on power dynamics start to crumble. And that is precisely why, when you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. If what you're hearing resonates deeply, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day practical path. Both are linked in the pinned comment. The power of silence when you stop justifying yourself. Silence, when it arises from integrity and not from passive omission, is one of the most transformative forces of the human psyche. Jung understood this with brutal clarity. He saw silence not as an absence of response, but as a presence of authority. When someone stops justifying themselves compulsively, they are not only avoiding conflicts or cutting conversations short, they are deactivating an entire system of psychological control that previously fed on their insecurity. This type of silence is deeply unsettling to others, because for those who have always expected you to bow, to explain yourself, to correct yourself, the absence of justification is interpreted as rebellion. And in a profound sense, it is rebellion. But not an immature rebellion, the kind that screams desperately to be heard. It is a silent revolution, an implicit declaration. I owe no explanations to be who I am. Manipulative people who feed psychologically on others' doubt begin to lose their power in the relationship. Because emotional manipulation only works when there is clearly perceptible vulnerability, when there is visible fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of disappointing. Manipulation requires reactivity. But the secure silence that comes from internal authority is like a stone wall. It does not respond reactively. It does not justify itself. It does not dance to anyone's music. It simply is. And this steadiness destabilizes any attempt at control. Moreover, relationships that have always depended on your submission, emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal themselves for what they truly are: fragile, one-sided, based on fundamental imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease to position yourself as someone who needs to be accepted, and you begin to occupy the space of someone who already accepts themselves completely. And this changes absolutely everything in your relational dynamics. Some people will distance themselves from you, and this is not a sign of error or failure. It is a sign of healthy realignment, because your silence begins to function as a natural filter. It reveals who was genuinely by your side out of authentic affinity, and who was only there because you were easy to control or manipulate. Jung said that the process of individuation often requires ruptures, separations. And this distancing is not punishment, it is liberation. When you stop justifying your presence, your boundaries, your choices, you start attracting relationships based on mutual respect, not on fear or psychological dependence. But you need to be prepared for internal resistance, because by stopping to explain yourself externally, you will also have to deal with your own anxiety. The part of you that learned for decades that you needed to be understood to have value will resist strongly. It will want desperately to go back to justifying itself. It will beg you to reconsider, to explain just this once. It is precisely at this moment that silence becomes a spiritual exercise, a practice, a conscious act of remaining whole, even in the face of profound discomfort. Silence, therefore, is not just the absence of words. It is the affirmation of being. It is the refusal to put your identity on trial. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it transforms into presence, a presence that naturally emanates authority. That commands respect without raising its voice. That establishes boundaries without needing confrontation. A presence that does not need approval to exist. Psychological integrity, when you stop convincing and start communicating. There is something magnetic about a person who feels no need to explain themselves, something that cannot be faked or forced. It is psychological integrity, the state of someone who no longer negotiates their own essence to fit external expectations. Jung understood this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. When the individual not only knows their truth, but upholds it consistently, without hesitation, without guilt, and above all, without the need for validation from others. An integrated person does not beg to be understood. They communicate, they express clearly, but they do not convince or persuade, because they do not start from the premise that they need to justify their existence. Their words come from a solid center, not from a hidden lack or desperate need. This changes everything in the way they are perceived. The world treats with more respect those who treat themselves with respect. And self-respect begins when you refuse to negotiate what is essential in you. Psychological integrity does not mean inflexibility or rigidity. It means coherence, alignment between inner truth and outer expression. It is the ability to maintain an internal line of truth, even in the face of external pressure. It is when you feel something uncomfortable in a situation, and even without being able to explain it rationally with perfect logic, you trust your feelings. You do not need to present evidence or build elaborate arguments. You simply say, "This does not resonate with me." And that is enough. That is complete. This stance, which seems deceptively simple, is actually revolutionary in a world where most people live completely disconnected from themselves, where decisions are made based primarily on the opinions of others, where feelings are systematically ignored for fear of seeming too sensitive, where boundaries are violated with forced smiles so as not to seem difficult. Integrity is the opposite of that fragmentation. It is the art of being whole, of not fragmenting yourself to please others, of not hiding to avoid conflict. Jung knew that true transformation does not happen when you learn more theories or accumulate more knowledge. It happens when you embody a fundamentally new stance towards life. And this stance begins with the refusal to justify oneself compulsively. Because every compulsive justification carries camouflaged insecurity. Am I enough? Am I acceptable as I am? The integrated person no longer asks this question. They know they are enough, simply by being authentically themselves. And this knowing is not arrogance, it is the natural result of having done the difficult inner work of individuation. When you reach this state, you no longer waste energy trying to convince others of your worth. You simply live from your center. You express when appropriate. You remain silent when that is the truth. And you trust that those who are meant to understand will understand, and those who are not will eventually fall away. This is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want without consequences, but the freedom to be who you are without apology. The freedom to exist without asking permission. The freedom to feel without justification. And once you taste this freedom, you can never go back to the prison of constant explanation. Because you finally understand what Jung knew. Your truth does not need to be defended, it only needs to be lived. The moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you truly begin to live.